Improved. CGI was decades past where, we had all started from. Things like the first state of movies, Lord of the Rings, everything coming out of DreamWorks and Pixar, right? But now we're going to get the stories to go with those premium visuals now. But Marvel had a dilemma. Where should they start?
So think about it. What do we all love about comic books? How many of you read comic books or at least go and see some of the films that are out there? There's a friendly audience here. So now I know some of you probably just like it because you got lots of people running around with spandex and capes, and that's kind of cool. Other people, you like the way the superheroes look. So others are remembering sort of your Greek literature class where you talk about the hero's journey and how they were able to bring this into the 20th century. But one of the most fundamental things that we get out of comic books that we don't get out of some other mediums is the interconnectedness between the various storylines. So if we take, for example, this character here, Daredevil. Daredevil lives Hell's Kitchen, a small corner or side of Manhattan, not too well. Guess what? Manhattan's the same island where Tony Stark builds one of his towers. And interestingly enough, Tony Stark's father worked on the original project to come up with this guy here, Captain America. When we think about the different threads and interconnectedness that make the universe so rich, what does this tell us about the way that we can begin to construct some of our universes? Whether that's with our systems, whether that's with the people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, whether that's how we interact with our families. And we're going to talk about some of these three primary things of principles, assets, and constraints that we can use to create these rich tapestries of the universe, where we don't necessarily know everything up front. We understand where we're going at the same time and are able to handle the things that come at us at a moment's notice, respond to those, and even be proactive in order to innovate more quickly. So if we think about the universe really as a tapestry, what is a tapestry? A tapestry, unlike the carpet that you see in here or some oriental rugs, tells a story. There are different components of this. We have different threads going through the tapestry that take us, for example, to being able to build the castle in the center there. They also have us talking about the guy off to the left there is kind of standing in front of the lake. Not really sure what he's doing. Was that intentional or was it not? But he's still part of the story. And we begin to wonder, is he going into that castle or not? And then we look at things like the white rabbit here. We've got the castle, guy doing some random thing. Perhaps he's hunting, that may be a rifle. If we were seeing the real thing, we may get a little more detail on that. To a little rabbit. Now, is this hair intentional? Is it part of the folklore of the overall story? Or again, is this something that emerges from intertwining these various threads together? And so let's start to deconstruct what Marvel did with their universe in order to make some of these threads.
So back to the movies. At the end of the day, Marvel is ultimately in the entertainment business. And like any business, they want to see up and to the right movement for the revenues. And to do that, because they're in the entertainment business, they need happy, satisfied, repeat customers. Sorry for the delay. So when we think about what does it take to take your average moviegoer and make them a repeat customer, probably need some characters that are well developed enough that they start to care about them. We need some complex and rich plot lines that the audience enjoys and keeps them coming back for more. We need some memorable villains to help move those stories along and provide that great tension that all great stories need. So how would a company that's been around in various forms and fashions since the late 1930s approach a problem like this? Let me ask the question a different way. Marvel's been collecting characters and stories since before many of us were even born. So a good place to start is with what they know, and to leverage their assets their existing assets as best they can before trying to go off on a very complex and risky venture of inventing new intellectual property just for their reboot. So in the Marvel Universe, the existing assets are those characters from the comics that we know and love. And so Marvel starts blocking the list to identify who is going to be the right foundation for their reboot of their film franchise. First thing, we're probably not going to start with the minor characters. The familiarity that people already have is in and of itself an asset that they should leverage. They need to be able to bring people into the theaters to experience some of that initial success and then to build upon that. Don't worry if you've got a favorite minor character, we're still going to weave them in. We're going to find a place and point in time. But we're not going to start there, and they're not going to be the foundation element. So do you remember those licensing deals with Sony and Fox? There's a downside. Some of our marquee characters, like Spider-Man and the X-Men, we're under a constraint. Marvel does not have the rights for the films for many, many years to come. So they will not be showing up. Next. Finally, we probably want to start to see some interconnectedness for the characters that we pick, to kind of help us build those greater and bigger stories that are going to capture people's interest. And as Marvel keeps going through this process, a clear front runner starts to emerge. Surprise, the Avengers, right? The Avengers are about 53 years old this month. They've been around forever. And they've got some of the most iconic characters in the Marvel Universe. Hulk, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, right? Great characters, a lot of potential there. But there's some even more interesting things about the Avengers as a whole that make them perfect to build a future film business on. If you look at the course of their history, they've had many different incarnations. As team members have, new team members have joined, old team members have left and moved on to do other things. For Marvel Studios, this is a tremendously valuable feature. Actors' contracts expire. They get more expensive. They want to go on and do more projects. So being able to introduce a new cast of characters over time and have that flexibility is very, very useful. And finally, second point, excuse me. The Avengers have always been a very diverse team. Since day one, they've had women, minority, and even alien team members. This is useful for modern audiences. People can go through the roster and find someone that they identify with that helps see a little bit of themselves in the movie and increases their satisfaction. Finally, the Avengers have faced some of the Marvel Universe's most threatening and powerful foes. You've got creatures like Ultron, Thanos, Loki, right? Tremendous capacity for conflict and action that is going to help with those storylines.
So it sounds like we're starting to set up with the right assets. We've got exciting characters built around the Avengers. We've got the villains. We've got key elements of the stories from the comic books themselves. But how do we start to weave these into an overarching picture and create an actual tapestry of a universe for that, similar to the tapestry that we just saw? So let's start to dissect this. Our threads, or our core assets, are these characters that are going to span from the beginning to the end of our tapestry. But in order to make the tapestry come alive and actually build a universe around this, we need to have certain things happen, certain intersection points that are these key events, these key happenings on which these characters are going to converge. And so the first one of these is, I've got a bunch of threads, how do I bring them together into this Avengers origin story and say that you have these parts, but now you have a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. So as you start to deconstruct it, and as you can see so fantastically there with the tiny font that we've got, we have the character threads, like Tony Stark, for example, like Captain America. We've also got characters like Natasha, the Black Widow, one of those minor characters, but what are we going to do in order to get them to the point where they actually are the Avengers? Because as we all know, it could be simply that we bring them together, let's do a giant mashup and boom, be done with it. But if we want a universe that sustains and builds on itself and keeps true to some of the core principles in the comics, but then allows folks like the writers and directors to have some degree of creative freedom, not understanding where that's going to go, we need to be a little bit more intentional. So the intentional part of this is who actually needs their own independent origin story. Why should we care about Tony Stark as Iron Man? What's the internal conflict that's going to make some of us relate to him or wish that we were him, because lots of money can build whatever he wants and seems to have time to do all that stuff that we'd like to do. Or at the same time, we want to be Captain America. And how do we relate to a person like him? So we begin to lay out some of these key origin stories that begin to get us that emotional attachment to the characters, that help us to understand their own internal conflicts, their motivations, and their drivers, so that when they come together as a collective whole, that collective whole of the Avengers is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is the first step to building this universe.
And the reality is, Marvel faces constraints, right? They weren't an incredibly wealthy company. They didn't have the financial resources that they do today. They could only get enough money for say, 10 movies in what they call phase 1. So they had to make some tough choices. If you're a Hawkeye fan, sorry, but he did get some good screen time in Thor and some of the other movies. But not everyone gets top billing. So time moves on. The first couple movies in the initial set of films start to demonstrate good financial success. And so Marvel starts to increase the complexity by introducing some more of these big characters. Right? Pop quiz, who is the #1 character in terms of total screen time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Does anybody know? Take a guess. Somebody, anybody. Iron Man? Okay. Trick question, it's actually Phil Coulson in the entire cinematic universe because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. screws up at the time. And if you take him out, you're right. Tony Stark is the #1 character, but Phil Coulson is still in the top 10. Right? And you see characters like Phil and Nick Fury make appearances time and time again, movie after movie, TV show after TV show, helping make this start to feel like a living, breathing universe. Right? That complexity goes directly to moviegoer satisfaction, consumer satisfaction. And as time progresses and as they start to tease the Avengers and when we know it's coming and we're looking forward to it, you know, on the business side, Marvel starts thinking, well, what do we do next? Right? We can't just like shut it down. We've got to plan, we've got to lay the groundwork, we've got to get the contracts in place, we've got to get the financing in place. So what's going to motivate customers beyond that first initial team up? And so finally, at the end of Avengers, we see the introduction of a big bad. We see Thanos, right? And if you're familiar with the comics, you understand how tightly integrated he is into kind of the Avengers history. And they do it in a way that doesn't reveal their entire hand, but we know something's coming. So, this brings us into what Marvel now starts calling Phase 2. Sound familiar to anybody that's done like a complex program or a roadmap? Right? And there's a pattern established. We introduce characters through origin stories. We bring them together for larger conflicts, and we find ways to kind of increase the complexity through minor characters. But Marvel's also been doing something very, very interesting the whole time. They've been planting some mysterious Easter eggs, right, all the way back to Thor, Captain America, even the original Iron Man and Incredible Hulk. Right? Things that you wouldn't expect unless you slow it down and watch the post-credit scene. And as we see the movies come out in Phase 2, they start to lift the curtain back on these devices, and you start to see how these non-character assets of the universe are contributing to a larger whole. Right? This is kind of the Empire Strikes Back of the Marvel Universe. Your villain starts to become more revealed. We start to understand their motivations, and we start to get a sense of voting. While Marvel's kind of doing the puppet master routine at the tapestry story arc level, they're also doing some interesting business things. They're taking some more deliberate risks, seizing the opportunity that their previous success has created for them. They take a lesser-known cast of characters aimed at kind of a younger audience with Guardians of the Galaxy, and yet they still tie it back to that kind of mega story arc around the Infinity Stones. And that's not the only thing that they do. They don't give you the same random, superheroes in spandex flying around summer action movie every single time. Winter Soldier has elements of political theater, or political drama. Ant-Man, it's arguably a heist movie, right? Kind of more like the Italian Job than anything else. And so all of this still is within that pattern that they have established. It culminates in an Avengers team-up. A new character is created, a villain, Ultron, is defeated, and that brings us to today. So this is Phase 3, which was kicked off with Captain America Civil War just a couple of months ago. And we can see that Marvel has things planned out for at least until the end of the decade. Right? We're going to see Doctor Strange this year. We're going to get sequels to Guardians of the Galaxy, Thor, Ant-Man. We're going to get to know Black Panther a little bit better. And Spider-Man, we finally got the rights back, and we're going to see him be a keystone element of the new universe. It's fantastic news for comics nerds like me. And this is all going to culminate in Infinity War, where that mega story arc is going to come to closure. Right? But look at what's beyond that. We see an untitled Avengers sequel. We see new characters getting, fleshed out like Captain Marvel. It's an interesting time for Marvel Studios. There's a huge complexity. Actors' contracts are expiring. We don't know if we're going to see the same roster. Care to take odds on who's in that untitled Avengers sequel? Bet you Spider-Man shows up. It's an interesting time.
So what does this universe, and how we construct this universe, illustrate to us what we need to do in our day-to-day lives, whether that's on a personal or professional level, with understanding the constraints, the principles, and these key assets that we have to leverage? I want you to think about it for a minute, and as you leave here today, we're going to leave you with 4 key points. But how do I start to apply some of these things when I go back and I architect my systems integration? Am I clear about the constraints that I've got? Do I understand these core principles? Or am I just kind of shooting from the hip? And when is it okay to shoot from the hip and allow a great degree of autonomy for the individual teams that may be working on one component of that, rather than trying to architect an entire universe top down, like maybe we would have tried to 15 or 20 years ago. The days have changed. Innovation moves too rapidly to allow us to have that kind of control. But by applying some of these things like high-level planning, these constraints, these principles, and these assets, it allows us to influence things in a way so that we begin to have that type of universe I described at the beginning, where innovation does flourish and thrive, where we have the right level of control over things. And so imagine what your world would be like if not only did you feel probably as excited at the end of your project as the folks that worked at Marvel Studios on some of these films did. I bet they felt pretty excited when they get to see the final product, and then the revenue from the film goes to the roof. But imagine what it would be like in your day job and in your personal life to feel as invigorated or excited as you do when arguably you leave your favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe film. Just that sense of excitement because you are relating to that superhero character. You understand where their destiny is taking them. And so we'll leave you with 4 closing points. Things that you can take away back into your personal and professional lives. First, know where you're going. Mostly. can't plan everything, but I at least want to know that I'm headed in that direction and not in this direction. When I start to do that, I can start to rally people behind me. And we can begin to operate as a team, as the Avengers do. Again, as the Avengers, we are greater than the sum of our parts. Whether this is your family, whether this is your group of friends, whether this is your colleagues and teammates in the office. Second thing, use what you've got. All the time, we don't need to build exciting new tools that have a high degree of risk. And certainly in the professional world, our executives don't always like to hear that we need to bring in a fancy new tool. But just like Marvel did, how can we leverage the key assets that we've already got in new and innovative ways to meet the objectives that we're going after? How can I use the personal assets that I have to achieve my own personal objectives outside of my work life? Think about it. Know the rules. There are rules. Some of these we make up for ourselves, some of these are given down from on high. But we need to understand what these rules are, to understand how we work among those constraints, how we work through and leverage those principles that are given. And yeah, sometimes when we gotta bend them a little bit. And finally, create space to move. If you saw the illustrations that we made, and we'll be happy to share those out because kudos to Bret for doing a significant amount of analysis, understanding how each of the characters connected to each one of these key events within the Marvel Cinematic Universe to start illustrating this tapestry. But there's space in them. 10 years ago when Marvel started on this journey, probably didn't know that they were going to do a heist movie with Ant-Man. But there's space for that within the universe because things are going to pop up and we need to take advantage of the opportunity. And by leaving the space for the unexpected, we're able to do amazing and creative things with that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. So as you leave here today, know this, each of us has not only the responsibility but the privilege to create our own universes. And whatever that looks like from a professional perspective, from a personal perspective. So take advantage of that and leverage some of these to make your own universe as exciting as Marvel makes their cinematic universe for us as we go and consume those products. Now, even though we create our own universe and taking a look at our own physical universe, we weren't able to convince Netflix to move up the Luke Cage release, which is happening next week. So time and space are two different things. That would have been sort of the follow-on party tonight that we all could have gone to, so we'll need to postpone that for another week. But would invite you for any open discussion, questions now, as we close out and have a few more minutes here.
So I know you talked a lot about Marvel, but let's look at DC. They had Batman. I mean, I guess it's still going to be allegory, but they had arguably Chris Nolan's Batmans were one of the most popular. But now when they're going to Justice League, they flop. They're not doing well. So when you look at their model versus Marvel's model, what do you guys think DC needs to almost take a cue on? Are they too late to the party then? And I guess you can still go with the allegory, because it's still, let's say you have a great project, Batman might be one of the best characters there is. What went wrong there?
So I mean, I'll give a first crack at it, and then Bret arguably is the subject matter expert within the comic realm. I think a couple of things. Number one, sort of knowing your audience. A lot of the DC commercial movies, they're arguably pretty dark, right, or harken back. And so you're kind of shutting yourself out of a particular audience and getting that mind share to enable you to do more things. So leveraging some of what you've got and understanding the audience. And we go this, the user experience sort of thing. I think the other thing is sort of having this larger plan where I don't know necessarily all the individual details, but how many different versions of Batman did we see? And then Christopher Nolan comes along and makes this really, if you like it, you like it. If you hate it, you hate it, sort of really dark thing. And then trying to weave that in with, like, what the hell is a Superman, as some people sort of said. And so kind of trying to do the same thing, but I would argue with less intention behind it and less overall structure around those principles, assets, and constraints. Right? What's your insight on this?
So I loved the Batman movies, and I think that's a case where DC knew their audience. They knew the space, they created a vision and executed to it pretty damn perfectly, right? I think when you think about, again, that larger universe, though, they had a narrow vision, right? They thought within Batman, and then they thought about Superman. They did not think about the union of the two. They did not think about the space between them. There was no, I'm not aware of, although I'd be happy to spend more research time going back and reviewing, I am not aware of the same kinds of complexity that DC introduced into the Christopher Nolan movies that could then lead to kind of the Zack Snyder movies that came after. No Easter eggs, no Infinity Gauntlet in Thor's kitchen or whatever the heck it was. There's nothing. They looked at things in isolation. And that's something that if you want to build something very complex and rich and fulfilling, you cannot afford to do. You must be able to take a couple steps back, see a bigger picture, and again, create that space that you're going to need to maneuver, right? I think, again, knowing your audience with the Superman movies and things like that, we're already hearing the studio executives start to tweak their formula. They did a reshoot of Suicide Squad, and we can expect Justice League and things like that to be a little bit more humorous, a little bit more colorful, right? When we watched Iron Man however many years ago, I bet you most of us laughed, right? Robert Downey Jr.'s got pretty good comedic timing. I didn't really laugh in Man of Steel. So I think a lot of little elements, a lot of that complexity, and starting to care about these characters as more than just one-dimensional things, right, are some critical components that DC has lacked.
I think that is pretty salient lessons for us in our professional lives as architects, right? It's that leaving that space for those things to happen, but knowing what that high-level structure is, so that I can tell Tom, for example, when you're doing this project, I'm not going to get in all up in your business. Tom may argue with that. You can talk about it. But I need you to make sure that you're going to do these three things, because those tie into this greater whole that are going to enable us.
Set guardrails, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know what? Marvel's not perfect, right? There are a couple of movies, Thor, and maybe that first Captain America could have been a little better in places. But they got enough. They had enough success to kind of keep that momentum, to kind of learn what worked and what didn't, so that they could iterate on that, fine tune it, tweak it, make the next thing even better. Right? Any other questions? Thoughts? Favorite characters?
No thoughts. Stunned silence. I mean, does this argument make sense? Are we totally off the rails? You guys watch too many comedy.
Can you talk a little bit more about where you see the principles coming into play? You clearly identified the assets and some constraints, but I didn't see as many clear examples of principles. Or are you saying that the leaving the openings and the having connections are the principles?
I think that would be one of the principles. I think another key principle is remain true to who the characters are, fundamentally. So I'm not going to go away from who Captain America is and sort of what drives him to the things. There may be some nuance in there that I'm going to make a little bit more contemporary. That's an example of one of the principles. You got another one?
I think and again, trying to figure out what to cover here versus what not, we threw out some ideas. But I think they're incredibly rigorous attention to detail, right? The absolute respecting of that which has come before within their ever-evolving universe, which becomes much more present when you start looking at Netflix and the Daredevils, the Electras, the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., right? How they're weaving, thematic elements, story elements, characters in from market segment to market segment, right? That to me is kind of the principle, and it requires rigor, it requires discipline, and moving forward, as this thing gets bigger and bigger, it's going to be more difficult for them.
Do you have any thoughts on Marvel has to manage now the complexity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and say the 616 universe in comic books, right? They have hundreds of universes with slightly different versions of characters. That
He's
seems
the
to
number for the Senate.
Was that?
He knows the
Yeah,
number.
it's MCU, 199,999, but yeah, that's your question.
That echoes a lot of problems that I've seen within larger enterprises, which is different parts of business competing with each other, playing in the same space. Do you have any story there that could be useful to people?
I mean, the story that, without doing a lot of research, I think there's going to be a certain audience who they're interested in the version that was in the comic books. No matter what you do, they're going to hate everything that you put up on the screen. But then there's sort of the version that, I was never into the comic books growing up, right? I'm intrigued by what they're doing from a cinematic perspective and how they're tying that in with some of their television assets and something like that. So I think fundamentally that goes back to knowing your audience and where you've got a little bit of overlap. So I can pull on that thread that maybe is in one of those universes over to one of the other universes in the multiverse, but at the same time, keeping these as sort of discrete business units. I'm sure Disney now is going to have their say as they go into this, but one of the things that Marvel did is setting up MCU, and along this journey, the MCU 199,999, is they put a panel of their core experts together in order to formulate what these core principles were and how it was going to operate, were they going to stay true to those stories and where they were not going to stay true to those stories, and give a little bit more autonomy to the directors and writers.
And they picked their points of control, right? They picked how much was going to be the same and what was going to be different. They've got TV shows that share many of the same thematic elements. I watch the new Avengers cartoon with my son every Saturday morning, right? And Thanos shows up, but it's different, right? There's differentiation there, and that's okay because they don't care, right? They understand at what level things should be consistent and where the natural breaking points and deviations ought to flow. And when we think about our professional and personal lives, we've got to make probably some intentional decisions there too, if we want to be as successful as they have been, right? So in a business, it's harder because it's not one mind making decision usually, right? When you do get bodies of people together, the more that you can be clear, the more that you can make those assumptions be explicit, the more that you lay out those guidelines in unambiguous ways, the more that you're going to create the room for people who are, incredibly knowledgeable and capable to move in the spaces that you create and to innovate and deliver value. So, at the end of the day, companies, larger organizations are going to have a little bit more chaos. It's natural. But think about being the Fed. Think about what are those macroscopic things that we can influence, the levers and dials that we can tweak so that we pick the right level of control point to get the ultimate results that we care most about.
And that's really a lot of the conversations that I've been having in the workplace are what are these strategic points of control from an architectural perspective? The way that the Federal Reserve adjusts the interest rate has different things affected on the economy without having, okay, what's in you're running the shop on the corner here? I don't care that you're doing that. That's legislated by a different set of laws and principles than the Federal Reserve is at the top. But they're able to influence things in that positive direction while allowing the innovation and the emergence that they never would have been able to imagine come to fruition. And I think more and more you've got folks like Chief Architect at Jet Propulsion Laboratories for NASA saying that they've got a chaotic architecture. And then you've got sort of the superstructure on the other side where, no, we've got everything planned out. I think more and more we're going to see the spectrum of gray. And the more that we can understand what these strategic points of control are, again, these principles, assets, and constraints like Marvel has executed on there, then I'm able to give folks like Tom that high degree of autonomy and high degree of freedom to go and experiment. But he's not going to mess around with our core enterprise data, right? That's one of those sacred things. And as long as he respects that and understands those guardrails, have at it, go and innovate. And that's what allows innovation to thrive, like we described at the beginning of the talk. And the same thing applies to my personal life, right? I want to know these key things that are sort of immutable, and then I'm able to drive to them with my family, with my friends, in directions that I never could have imagined.
Does pacing that
for the timing of when certain things are going to happen. Do you want to maybe take that over?
So I would say particularly early on, largely financial constraints, right? So Marvel Studios existed for a long time, and to kind of really move from just getting 60 million to getting lots and lots of money, they needed to be the producer themselves. And to do that, they had to basically get financing, which covered, I think, about 10 movies. And they actually had to put up some of the rights to their intellectual property kind of on a note in case they weren't able to cover that money. But I think things started to change over time. Again, you know, Avengers made them a lot of money, so they were in a much different position and able to take some more specific risks. Can't really exactly tell you why they chose Guardians of the Galaxy. It was kind of scratching my head at the same time. But you do start to see them introduce those very, very large themes, right? So we know that for a long time they've been marching towards Infinity War, and that's got to be one of the most measured and paced things that they have done. And I tend to believe that they've figured out the other things on the margins based on availability of actors, financing, where they're experiencing success in the market, what they've learned from previous films. Are we feeling too saturated on Captain America? Should we shift it up and introduce some new characters? I think some of that comes in, but you do have those major touchstones, right? As soon as they knew they needed a big bad beyond Loki, that's been probably the driving thrust of most of their planning.
Yeah, one of the ways that I have thought about this, I'm not sure Bret exactly agrees with me. So we've got, in this illustration, we've got sort of the key assets of the characters over here that are spanning. And then we've got things that are happening in between. But these things that are happening, there's a couple of them that are actual films. So like the Thor origin story, for example, or Guardians of the Galaxy, or Ant-Man origin story. But all these other things are things that I know need to happen within that universe. So for example, yeah, you know this.
Infinity Gauntlet, 6 stones, right? If we're gonna have Infinity War, I gotta introduce the stones. As of now, we've introduced 4 of them. Kind of through sleight of hand in a number of cases, the Tesseract, the Scepter, the Orb, I can't remember the 4th, but the mindset.
But when you start to look at it that way, my assertion is that the film is sort of an invisible box that's on the outer layer of the tapestry. That's the intersection of these characters and these certain things that happen to arrive at a certain point in time. And so there, one way to look at it is it's more emergent, because I know I want these things to happen with these certain people. That's all going to come together, and that's going to be my film. Right, go ahead.
If I had more time and energy, you could take each of those origin stories and decompose it further, because there are so many interesting Easter eggs. Right? The Infinity Gauntlet shows up in Thor. Captain America's shield shows up in the Hulk. Very few people know these things. Go to Wikipedia, it's awesome. You can learn so much stuff, right? And I don't believe when they did all of these things, they knew what was going to pan out and what wasn't, right? You place a couple bets, some of them pan out, some of them don't. And I think that distinguishing between the things that must become true and the things that are kind of maybe hopefully, right? That we're going to try to create a little motion and see what plays out. I think that's in large part, again, why we can look at Marvel being so successful and other companies like DC, you know, maybe not having that perspective or that forethought.
Well, I think we're out of time, folks. We'll be around for a little while longer.